Some sense might be coming back to Hollywood as Margot Robbie is questioning why certain scripts are greenlight when she's seen them and they are absolutely terrible. Before we get into this, I'd like to ask you please hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos here at the Trent Report. And I am very pleased to welcome special guest, the script doctor, to discuss these comments that Margot Robbie did indeed make. So, welcome to the channel, Script Doctor.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it's great having you here. I'm always enjoy your company, and your insight is phenomenal. And I think this is right up your alley as well. That's why I asked you to come. So this is over at thatparkplace.com. Barbie actress, and she was the producer as well. Margot Robbie questions why Hollywood greenlights certain films. Why is this being made? There's nothing new or interesting. So this was in a massive interview with Deadline, basically PR for the awards calendar, I guess, that's been happening in Hollywood over the past couple weeks. And she was asked about her movies, etc., that she produces. And she was asked, did it feel like a radical approach when you set out with the company talking about the sense of holding the good and bad in the same hands? And this is what she said as part of her answer. She said, so unless I striving to make a movie that's as good as those movies, I'm just going to rewatch them. So she's talking about how she basically likes a lot of these older movies that she'll rewatch, and she's like, what is the point of even making a film in that vein if it's not going to be better than these ones? I'll just go rewatch them instead. And I thought that was a really interesting approach that she had there. And do you think that's something that maybe Hollywood needs to start thinking about, especially like script writers and film producers and things like that?
Well, the irony is that the vast majority of actual working producers have this mentality already, but not all of them are in certain positions of power where they can greenlight the types of scripts that meet that requirement. And then the other part is that, unfortunately, a lot of professional screenwriters, whether they're veterans or even starting out, prefer to write chasing a trend so as they can get that deal. And that trend is usually a little bit of stay safe, what's happening now, what's hot, what's a type of a genre that's really popular. Time loop genre was a thing for a bit, so there's lots of time loop scripts, but there's nothing ever new or inventing exciting about them. And it's this big contradiction that faces the industry because you're dealing with millions of dollars in budget. So you have to be responsible for that amount because a failure can really have a negative impact when you're dealing in the millions of dollars. But at the same time, you're trying to create something that is going to draw people in. And what draws people in is something a little bit unknown, but also a little bit familiar. And basically takes a risk in some regards. Not just in the budget side of things, but on the creative side of things. How are you stretching your creative muscles? How are you inspiring people that are watching your film and entertaining them in ways that they haven't been entertained before? And that's a really difficult thing to do. And that's where business and art has to actually be more symbiotic as opposed to a business model saying, well, here's a spreadsheet of things we want to do. This is what we know it sells. This is what we think the audience wants. And we want you to write to these parameters. And that's not always a good method for making movies. And we've seen how those films kind of get lost by the wayside as a result, because what are they saying? What are they doing that's new and fun and inventive? This is something I completely understand with Margot Robbie. I'm a little surprised that she's revealing this information now. This is usually something a lot of producers figure out pretty soon as they start producing. So either she was never asked this question before, or this is a new revelation to her.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked as well, and that's why I covered it because it was so surprising to hear someone actually kind of say this. I feel like we don't really hear a lot of this in Hollywood. They don't really want to say all of this stuff. Like a lot of this stuff is actually terrible.
Not
That
publicly,
they,
no. That's the thing. Is
yeah,
they say it privately. They tell me about it, but they don't really advertise that in the trades.
right. So I thought this was refreshing that she was saying it. So she also went on and said this. Also, it costs so much to make a movie. Sometimes you'll read a script and think, why is this being made? There's nothing new or interesting, to your point, nothing better than what has already been done a million times before. Why would anyone want to spend millions of dollars, sometimes tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, on something we've already seen? That is just crazy to me. It's a horrible waste of money and a horrible waste of people's time. It takes years to make a movie, and it takes so much money to make a movie. So if you're not really trying to do something, I just don't know why you'd bother at all. She then pondered, maybe studios have quotas to fill and release dates to hit, but as producers, we don't. There's no tally, have to hit like by the time I'm 50, I have to have made 30 movies. It's like, no, just make the great ones. I just don't understand how you muster the energy to start the journey by aiming for mediocrity. Is this something that you see from Hollywood studios? It sounds like she does indeed see this from studio executives. Maybe it's because they are so risk averse that they end up aiming for mediocrity rather than trying to aim for greatness. Is this something that you've seen in Hollywood as well?
Well, I say this has to do with, the poison that is the modern marketing departments, and I hold them accountable not just for, uh, trying to make movies on a spreadsheet, but also for leaning into enough social trends that you end up getting very peculiar agenda-driven films because they're getting data that says that this is a popular thing. Look, over on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok, people are saying these things and these people are marginalized, and it's trending into the millions, so clearly there's an audience there, so we should write to that audience, when in fact it's really just, much smaller group of people that have a high frequency of output in regards to those subjects. So they're getting skewed data and they don't know how to read data properly. And
And it might be bolstered by bots too, to be
exactly,
honest.
that's exactly it. It might be bolstered by bots. So you're basically getting a bunch of inexperienced, foolish marketing heads that are a directing the creative aspect of filmmaking. And the other part too is Hollywood has always been striving to try and lower the bar for the audiences so that they can make more money. It's really just makes it easier and safer for them.
Can
They
you
don't
explain that?
want
What do you mean by lowering the bar?
well, increase the output. Um, don't take as many risks, repeat the derivative things that people like. So, for instance, you take a look at the straight to DVD market of the early 2000s. There were so many teen sex comedies that were just kind of kit bashed together and put out there. There was terrible parodies. There was the action movie, the old guy with a gun type of trope that was before the John Wick revival. There was a whole bunch of like drug and mob sting operations and real serious melodramas. We didn't get many sports comedies. We would then get the infrequent biopic as well. These were all just kind of crapped out as quickly as possible to jump onto the DVD market and the at-home release market because that's where a third party buys up massive units of that physical media and that offsets any costs or expenses. So you end up getting a higher profit return. But in order to make certain numbers to see that profit, you have to crank out as much content as possible. When you're cranking out as much content as possible, your level of quality has to be diminished because you cannot spend a whole lot of time making that the best thing it can be. So, because you're hitting your own deadline, you're trying to make sure you're paying off any of your loans or lines of credit so that you're not being hit too hard with the interest. So, when you lower the when you diminish the quality overall, and you keep that level relatively consistent, audiences get conditioned for that. And that allows them to basically curtail the level of quality that they can put out. Oh, we don't have to worry about certain continuity between scenes or shots because we've already made enough movies that people have bought and enjoyed with regards to special effects or sex or nudity or what have you, that we don't have to worry about perfection. And when they don't have to worry about perfection or strive to it, the quality goes down. And that's on the production side of things. Then you have the whole idea of, oh, well, now we need stories to tell so we can make these quicker and faster. And so you look for writers that can turn in assignments within a strict deadline. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough. And that's another mentality. That's a TV mentality that has unfortunately gotten into the feature side of things, which is if something happens on television during a shoot for that week for an episode, they don't have time to stop, process, and rewrite and address it appropriately. It has to be done that day in that instance. It's why I get hired sometimes in emergencies. It just has to be good enough to make the day. And if it doesn't make sense in the final product, who cares? We've got another show coming out next week. We'll make that one better if we don't have an accident or some sort of issue. Sometimes that mentality, in recent years, that mentality has been creeped over into films where it doesn't matter. It's just good enough. You take a look at some of the special effects for your big budget tent poles and how they don't look as convincing, how you can tell they're in the volume or how the compositing is off. Well, it's good enough because they didn't want to push back the movie to miss their window. And that's a big problem. And that's where you get that lowering of mediocrity. And to Margot's point, she has a very valid reason. Why make something mediocre about a subject that has been done already better in the past? And it goes into one of my favorite pieces of advice. When you are a creative, you're not competing against the worst that's out there. You're competing against the best, because you're going to get producers that have got this mentality that Margot has, which is show me something that makes me think, wow, this is as good, if not better, than Philadelphia Story or something of that nature, which one of the movies she mentions in this article.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that interesting too, because I mean, obviously though, there are people that are out there greenlighting a lot of bad scripts. We've seen that over the past couple of years. I mean, you think of things like the Charlie's Angels reboot that Elizabeth Banks did. You look at the new Terminator, Dark Fate,
Hmm.
even the Ghostbusters 2016. Those movies kind of come to my mind as just absolutely terrible. And then obviously you can just look at what Marvel's put out the last couple of years, and then DC just this year. So, like, what is going on that those things are getting greenlit? Obviously, the DC thing is a little bit more complicated because of all of the changing of the guard and everything at Warner Brothers and everything that's going on with the studio heads over there and all of that. But I mean, leaving them aside, like, I mean, we're looking at all these different studios and they're all kind of putting out sequels and stuff like that that just were really subpar. And then not only were they derivative, but they were also trying to basically warp their entire franchise, put it on its head, replace the I guess machismo male characters with female characters and things like that a lot of times.
Yeah, well, that leads into the marketing aspect where they're doing existing established IPs that sell well based on a legacy of knowledge, and that's antithetical to movies. Movies are about new stories or old stories told in a new way with new characters, and they're not always supposed to be guaranteed to be huge blockbusters. You want the mark of a successful movie is how well it holds up in the cultural zeitgeist of things after years after time. That's not a great model for businesses, of course, because again, they're in the business of
Right.
making money. But you can't force that. You cannot force audiences to buy your product unless you actually have something good about it based on its own scale of merit. Terminator Dark Fate, the premise alone didn't have to be a Terminator movie. It could have been any type of time travel movie. And it probably would have worked if it wasn't a Terminator movie because even though it had things that were shared with Terminator, it could have been presented as its own thing. Yes, a derivative of Terminator, but here's our own take on it. Here's our own take on time travel, on a time travel versus AI thing. Same thing with Ghostbusters. That's a Ghostbusters in name only movie, and it would have probably been fine if it wasn't a Ghostbusters film because it wouldn't have the offensive at nature of the fact that it didn't have much of a script. It was mostly improvised. It was obnoxious. Uh, doesn't work well in the tone of what the franchise was, and that comes back to again, the fear. Studios want to make original stuff, but they know it's a high risk. It's you're sinking in millions of dollars for something that might not sell. And the marketing department comes in and tries to, put a blanket around the studio heads, a comforting sequel blanket or so, or existing IP blanket, and say it's okay if we put this IP over top of this story, it will have a better chance of selling because people already know it. And it's really just a terrible method because it's essentially a department that is designed to try and sell you something you don't need, saying we don't know how to sell stuff you don't need, but if we put another brand label on it, if we put the brand before the content, we think that will sell better. And
I
it's terrible method in my opinion.
I think I get what you're saying that is terrible. I also get where they're coming from on that too, because I actually think that they're obviously it does work in the short term. I think you can do that, especially. I mean, we saw that with Star Wars, right? The Force Awakens,
Hmm.
massive numbers at the box office, and then Last Jedi even still had pretty decent had really good numbers as well. But then what's the next movie after that? Solo, Star Wars story, and you're losing money, and you've just damaged your brand.
Hmm.
So in the short term, I think there's like obviously you can have good success with that. But once people figure it out, it's like, well, I know your trick, right? It's what is
It's
the
the fool
phrase
me
like?
once
Yeah,
axiom. Yeah.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
that's
you're
what the marketing department is kind of trying to do. And I miss the days where they would look at something that was interesting and had potential and they'd be like, we've never seen this before, but we know how to sell it. And they just brainstorm all methods and ideas for like a viral marketing campaign or something of that nature. Today, or at least when I was starting to get some really good traction in writing, I would get, we've never seen anything like this. It looks great, but we don't know how to sell it. And it's baffling because if you were to go to any other business, any other company that offered a service and they told you they didn't know how to do the service they were offering, you wouldn't hire them. And yet here in
Exactly.
Hollywood, they're in the room making creative decisions.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. If you have something that's like if you have a good product, you got to figure out a way to sell it. I mean, I just think about those like infomercials and those there was like those two guys that were always like competing, selling like the whatever new chopper that they had, and they would find a way to sell their like chopper, and they had like
Yeah.
unique, interesting ways to do it, but they found a way to do it. So
Look at all the things it can cut: newspaper, fish, can.
yeah,
Like, it's just weird.
yeah, they found a way though. They found a way.
Exactly.
So this kind of gets to your point here where she says that the studios are operating due to fear. She says it's autopilot and a lot of it comes from a place of fear. People make the safe choice because everything feels scary. I get that too. Trust me. Like I said, I've got 10% of that in me. I just happen to have 90% of me that's more optimistic. So the 10% that's operating from a place of fear can only ever make me aware of the scary potential outcomes. It really can't sway my decisions. If I were putting up all the money, I might be operating from a place of more fear. But if you act on that impulse every time, you're going to play things way too safe. And I don't believe you can really make great art when you're playing things safe. There's a difference between being responsible and playing it safe. A big, big difference. We are always being responsible. We're responsible producers and filmmakers, but I definitely can't stand the idea of playing things safe. So, what do you make of this here? And is there kind of a balance between? I mean, I know we kind of talked about this a little bit
Mhm.
between playing it safe and I guess what does she say here? What does she say?
Well, essentially, the subtext is taking a little bit of a risk. How do you find that balance? And that's what a good producer, good writer, good studio manages to do. It's like, well, what's a good way to play it safe? Well, let's get some reliable names that people want to go see in movies. And what's the risk? Well, we're doing a story that not many people are really familiar with. So we're banking on the attractive nature of the cast to bring people in, and ideally their execution of the roles and the story that we believe in will mitigate that risk, and we'll get word of mouth, and then things will go well. And that's a very dicey situation to put a lot of producers in. Um, but that's one of the parameters when it comes to making films. You got to uh, take a look at what the weaknesses are in the risk factor and find ways to have other elements do the heavy lifting to take care of those weaknesses. So many, so many stories that have been made and became franchises were done so with a lot of risk. For instance, Warner Brothers started the superhero feature film. They they realized we cannot have a named actor really for Superman because people are just going to see that named actor. But we can get named actors for the villain. We can get named actors for the supporting characters. We can get Marlon Brando. We can get Gary Cooper. We can get Gene Hackman. People will go see them in movies, and then that will help with Christopher Reeve. And we've got an actor who can do the role. But those other three names will draw people in because they've established a relationship with the audience in the sense that they have been in movies that they have liked, and they go to see them. And now we're hoping that their networking, so to speak, with Christopher Reeve will get people to want to see Christopher Reeve movies. And that ended up working because they
Yeah,
also made
yeah,
a really
four
good
films, right?
product. Yeah, for four
Five
movies.
if you count the one in the early 2000s, like
Yes.
the Superman
But
Returns or
that's
whatever.
kind of the model where it is. It's like we've never done anything like this before. We will get some named actors in there to try and get interest. And then that's just how it works. If you try to do something like Star Wars was a huge risk because it didn't really have huge named actors. It had a bunch of character actors, and Harrison Ford was just on the rise at that point. He was still kind of relatively unknown, but it was really, I mean, Alec Guinness was the biggest name in that movie. And I doubt a whole lot of people wanted to see it because of Alec Guinness at that time. They were leaning in on something that was even riskier, which is the special effects. Like the trailer alone was something that people had never seen um, for a movie, and that intrigued them enough for it because it looked like a hokey sci-fi film, or at least that would be the general zeitgeist at that time. But the special effects drew people in, and then people connected with the characters because you had a bunch of these relatively unknown actors to give convincing performances. And George Lucas had to spend a lot of money on the special effects to get people in on the trailer so that they would watch this movie. And he was very fortunate that it worked out the way it worked. And then you take a look at some of the original movies that the Golden Globus team did, where you don't know anyone in them and you don't see anything from that. Or maybe like something as silly as like the Andy Sedaris films, which are just Playboy models on the beach doing action scenes. He's trying to do the same thing, but on a much smaller budget, and he doesn't put any of the quality in. So that's the types of risks that all filmmakers have to explore when it comes to creating new stuff. And for today, for studios, they are very terrified of taking those risks. They want to do everything they can to hedge their bets because it's just a lot less painful than having to deal with a failure that's going to stick with you for the rest of your career.
Yeah, another one that took a huge risk was Peter Jackson, The Lord of the Rings, filming all three of those films back to back to back, and then releasing them year after year after year.
Yeah,
And
and a
so
lot of
that was
them
a
with
huge
kind
risk.
of just not necessarily A-list stars, but very good, reliable character actors, people that have been around for a moment. The only reason we got those movies as good as they were was not just because of Peter Jackson and his loyalty to what the content was going to be, but also Ted Turner kind of prepaid for all those films anyway, so there was no real loss for New Line when making them.
Yes. I do think that is something that it does require balance. I probably is a hard thing to do because you have to be able to you're trying to predict the future, right? Are people
Mhm,
actually going to like this? Is your marketing team going to be able to get people interested in it? Is the script actually really good? Which I think that probably should be the easiest part, right? If you actually have a pretty solid script, I feel like most people should be able to tell that. But I don't know. It seems like a lot of people don't. I mean, Margot Robbie is saying here that like she reads scripts and she's like, why did this even get greenlit? What is going on here? Why do you think? I mean, I know we've talked about the fear and all of this and a lot of this
mhm.
stuff, and we've talked about like following the trends. Is there anything else that you think that maybe these producers are greenlighting these scripts even though they know that they're terrible? Like, do you think a lot of these producers realize that some of these scripts are just absolutely terrible and they greenlight it anyways? Is there like what why would is there a reason why they might do that?
Yes. So in those cases here, you're looking at assignment gigs. So the producers have their assignment, which is they have an IP or some sort of concept that they want to do, and they put out an open assignment call. And that means writers come in, they pitch their takes, and the producer picks the best take to give them the assignment. And then if the script comes in and it meets what they want, then they do the green lighting. And what's sad is that the stuff that is greenlit, unfortunately, is the best results that came in that producer that greenlit it saw from their perspective, their taste wise, of course, they felt those were the best. When you're looking at something like a spec script, which is it's an original story, original IP, made by the writer, they're shopping it around looking for a sale. Those ones are a lot harder to sell because number one, the producers aren't generally interested in them at the first place. So it's up to the writer to convince them that it's a good idea, just to get them to do a read. And then from there, they have to determine if from that read is it worthy of actually producing. And most of those ones don't move as well as the assignment gigs because with the assignment gigs, as I said before, you're dealing with someone that is already interested in the IP. All you have to do is just deliver something that hits all their interest points to try and get that sale and green light. And it's a narrow perspective because it's whoever holds the power to greenlight it. So if they really like something that is written that the majority of people working on it think this is mediocre, there's nothing you can do about it because the taste is in the hands of what one individual that did the greenlighting. And it's not always going to be a green light by committee. It's usually going to be a green light by an original person. However, the assignment and the notes that come afterwards could be by a committee that works underneath that producer that greenlit the project. And that's when you start getting into a whole lot of crazy back and forths, rewrites, possible reshoots, everything that is hectic about movie making because everyone's trying to appease the guy whose taste greenlit that film.
Right. All right. So let's continue here. I think she's just talking about what she has in development, actually. So I guess the last thing I want to really ask you is, um, based on Margot Robbie's comments here, do you think that maybe we start seeing higher quality scripts coming out and higher quality movies in the future Do you think that they move away from those trends? I know you've talked about this previously, that you think the new WGA deal with the reduction in the productions is going to create higher quality because you're going to have kind of a weeding out of diversity hires and people who were probably unqualified to begin with. But do you think that, do you still see that happening? I mean, I know we're still like, we're not even a year out from the strike being resolved and the deal being struck. But are there, I mean, I think this is a big sign here. The fact that she's even saying this, that a lot of the scripts suck in Hollywood, is just, I think, enormous that she's actually saying that.
Mhm.
But do you see any other evidence maybe indicating that? And on to the counterpoint, do you see maybe it continues as is?
Sadly, it's part of the producer's game, and the producer's game is one of whatever sells at the moment. So I think it's going to take some time before we start seeing a turnaround in quality. As I've mentioned before, the new WAG agreement on the TV side of things is going to have a lot of pushback because it has that residual based concept into it, which means if you're not good enough to make sure the show is good in its final product, you're compromising everyone else's residuals on that show. So you're going to be kicked out, replaced with someone that can do that. That's where you're going to see a lot of people that were hired in based on not their writing skill, but on other aspects be phased out. And they're going to fight very hard to not be kicked out. And they're probably going to go to some of these producers, maybe like Margot Robbie or maybe other people with the same level of influence that she has in town to pitch their own ideas and maybe do their open writing assignment gigs. And so you're going to have some producers that will have to learn the hard way that these types of scripts do not measure up, and you actually need something that gets you excited genuinely. And when you start talking about it outside of the normal circles of Hollywood, gets those people excited as well, because that's going to be your metric to whether or not you're in line with a potential audience. And the other thing to consider, and sadly, a lot of producers haven't been thinking about this too much, is that every movie that they're putting into production has between 1 to 3 years before it will be released to the public. So you have to make sure that you are on point with the direction of where audiences' attentions are being focused, so that when your project comes out, it's going to be right in their target. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and that requires more than just listening to a bunch of data miners calling themselves marketing teams. It requires you guys in the producer side of things to do the legwork yourselves, and the old school legwork. And that is, traveling around, looking at various demographics, what they like, what they want, and finding scripts that hit those things, as opposed to trying to manufacture scripts that are hitting those things.
Yeah, obviously, I think one of the examples that we saw this past year, I mean, we saw a couple of examples this past year. Sound of Freedom was a massive box office hit. I think it kind of really took the steam out of films like Mission Impossible,
Hmm.
7, and then we saw at the end of the year Godzilla minus one just doing, I thought, extraordinarily well, even for its. I mean, it hasn't hit
For a
100
foreign
million
language
dollars,
film, absolutely,
but
yeah.
yeah, it did number one Toho film ever in the U.S. So and had a great story. So we are seeing examples of that, of kind of like maybe there are some people that are figuring out where that audience is already, and hitting it. But I wanted to thank you for joining us. Love your discussion, your analysis, breaking this down for us, and really kind of giving us some more insight into what Margot Robbie has to say here and what it's like, what producers are thinking, what screenwriters are thinking, etc. Love having you on the channel, and hope to have you back sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. I'm here if I'm available. It's always a
All right,
pleasure, John.
have a good one.